Sarah works as a waitress on a luxury cruise ship, where she regularly interacts with wealthy and powerful passengers. One day, while carrying a tray of drinks through the grand and ornate lobby, she suddenly realizes that the wealthy man sitting in the corner of the restaurant is her husband Michael, who passed away 7 years ago. A cold feeling spreads through her body as memories of happy moments with Michael come flooding back. Still bewildered, Sarah approaches him, and for the first time in years she feels joy. The good news that she is pregnant has turned her peaceful life upside down in the best way possible. Twins. Sarah and Michael have always dreamed of having a family, but being pregnant with twins is more than they could have imagined. Sitting in the cozy lounge, Sarah watches Michael's eyes light up as she shares the good news. His face is a mixture of disbelief and joy. Twins, he asked, his voice shaking with emotion as he stroked her thick black hair. We're having twins, Sarah nodded, a smile spreading across her cheeks. Can you believe it? Michael pulled her into a tight hug, his breath shaking with excitement. I can't believe it, Sarah, this is everything. Everything we've been waiting for. They both felt on top of the world, their small but simple life perfect. They lived in a modest suburban home, not lavish but filled with love. They both worked hard, and although they didn't have much, they always had each other, and now they had the future they'd always dreamed of, a family. The next week, they were busy choosing baby names, designing the nursery, and planning for their new life. Michael joked about learning to change 2 diapers at once, while Sarah made a list of clothes and supplies. They had no idea how they would pay for it, but it didn't matter because they were happy. The sweet joy was short-lived, however, as the storm approached. A late evening call. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the living room. Michael had gone out to run an errand, bringing home some groceries for dinner, while Sarah stayed home, her hand casually resting on her growing belly. She was daydreaming about the future, imagining the 2 children running around in the yard when the phone rang. Strangely, was Michael home yet? She answered, her voice calm, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to strike. Hello, she said. The voice on the other end was cold and formal. Yes, I'm calling about your husband, Michael Thompson. There was a pause that was enough to make Sarah's heart beat faster. There's been an accident. The words were hard to believe. What accident? My Michael just went shopping. How could there be an accident? But the voice continued, giving details she didn't want to hear. He lost control of the car and ran off the road. We searched the area but didn't find his body. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still, the room closing in around her. Her breathing stopped. No, this can't be happening. I don't understand, Sarah stuttered, barely able to form sentences. What do you mean? You haven't found him? The voice was softer, but the words were still cruel. We believe the river may have carried the car into the water. It's possible his body was washed away. Sarah's knees went weak. She fell to the floor, clutching the phone as if it were her only lifeline. Michael disappeared for a moment, her mind screaming that this couldn't be right. There had to be some mistake. But the grave voice on the other end of the line proved otherwise. The following days passed like a dream, with no end, no body to lay to rest, only the words of strangers and the empty space in life where Michael had been. Friends and family tried to comfort, but no words could fill the void. He was gone, and all that remained was a stifling silence in a house that had once been filled with joy. And just when Sarah thought things had gotten worse, a new crisis began. One day there was an unexpected knock on the door. She opened it to find a stranger with a stern and impatient face. Mrs. Thompson? The man asked. Yes, I'm here to collect a debt your husband owed, he replied, clearly knowing the answer. I don't understand. What debt? Sarah frowned. Your husband borrowed a large sum of money from a lending institution, and now, since he's gone, the responsibility for paying it off falls on you. The man laughed coldly. My husband never mentioned any debt. We're not rich, but we've always taken care of ourselves. How's that?" She replied, her voice weak. "I don't have any money." The man's smile did not fade. "It's not my problem. You'll find a way to pay, or we'll find another way with that." He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, stunned and terrified. The weight of the world seemed to be pressing in on her from all sides. She was pregnant and alone, and now she was saddled with debt she could not pay. The life she and Michael had dreamed of had turned into a nightmare she could not escape. The days that followed passed like a dream, with no end or light in sight. Sarah tried to hold on for the sake of her unborn children, but with each passing moment, the harsh reality became clearer. She was alone and the world seemed to be closing in on her. Sarah's heart pounded in panic, and her hand instinctively went to her stomach. The nurse noticed her anxiety and placed a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. "The babies are fine," she said softly, "but Mommy is working too hard. She needs to rest." The word rest seemed like a cruel joke to Sarah. How could she rest when her whole life was in turmoil? But the nurse's words echoed in her mind. Sarah realized she had to be more careful. She was fighting not only for herself but for her children. With no other choice, Sarah reduced her hours, but this only made things worse. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and the threats from creditors became more severe. She tried to sell what little she had, but it did nothing to ease the burden of her debts. Every penny she earned seemed to disappear into the abyss of debt, leaving her with nothing. The stress became unbearable, and she spent long nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she would ever get through another day. Sarah's mind was filled with dark thoughts, doubts creeping in like shadows in the night. She felt trapped, suffocated by the pressure of her circumstances. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered her children, all that was left of Michael. Even though he had left her in a mess, she couldn't give them up. They were the light in the darkness, the only reason she had to go on living. When the twins were born, Sarah was exhausted. She held the babies in her arms, their tiny fingers clasping her own, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of peace in the quiet of the hospital room. She vowed that no matter what, she would protect them. She would find a way to survive, even if it meant sacrificing everything. But reality awaited her outside the hospital doors. The world hadn't changed while she was in the hospital. The loan companies were still there, demanding payment. And now, with 2 mouths to feed, Sarah's situation had become even more difficult. What had started as a gentle whisper of fear had become a constant growl in her ears.
As the weeks passed, Sarah's life continued in a whirlwind of sleepless nights and hard work days. Her 2 children, crawling and laughing, were the only bright spots in her otherwise gloomy existence. But every smile, every laugh, carried a constant threat. On one particularly bad day, when the phone rang with demands for more payments, Sarah realized she had to change. She couldn't continue living like this, living in fear of the next knock. She needed a way out, and when the opportunity came, it wasn't a lifeline but a chance to board a luxury cruise ship. A tough job that promised enough money to pay off the debts that had haunted her for years. It was the only option, and without hesitation she took it.
Sarah worked long hours, her legs aching after each shift, but it was a small price to pay for the money she was making. She lived by herself, avoiding conversations with her coworkers, focusing on raising her children, paying off her debts, and building the future she was trying to realize. On the 4th day, however, as she carried a tray of drinks to a table at a fancy restaurant, Sarah's entire world came crashing down. Sitting at one of the tables in a smart suit was Michael. Sarah stood silently, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the man. For a moment she thought she was being haunted, unable to believe it was him. Michael had died 7 years ago, leaving her alone to carry the pieces of her life, raise her children, and face the mountain of debt that had nearly swallowed her. But now he was alive, and more than that, he looked completely different. His hair was neatly combed, his suit clean and expensive. He sat with a calm confidence that made Sarah's heart flutter. Beside him was a beautiful woman with shiny black hair and a warm smile. She chuckled softly when Michael said something, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Sarah clenched her hands holding the tray, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. How could this be happening? Her thighs went weak, and for a moment she thought she might collapse right there in the middle of the restaurant. A voice from another table of waiters pulled her back to reality, one of the senior staff gently nudging her towards the group of customers waiting for drinks. With shaking hands she tried to bring them their drinks, while her mind was still reeling from the image of Michael alive again. She couldn't face him right here. Not now, but how could she not? She needed answers. The man who had disappeared from her life, whose body had never been found, was sitting a few meters away from her, alive and well. What did that mean? He had been hiding all this time. Why had he left her as soon as his shift ended? Sarah rushed back to her small cabin, her heart rate rising, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. Michael, who had once been her whole world, was now a stranger. Her head was full of questions without answers, but one thing was clear: she had to face him, she had to know the truth. That afternoon, Sarah paced the deck, waiting for the restaurant to close, rehearsing what she would say. But when the moment came, when she finally saw him leave with that woman, the words she had rehearsed fell away. Instead, pure instinct propelled her feet toward him. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stepped into his path. Michael's voice rang out, barely above the noise of the restaurant, but it was enough to make him stop. He turned, his body stiffening as he faced her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something flashed in his expression: recognition, perhaps even guilt, but it was gone quickly. He frowned, his face hard as a mask of indifference. "Excuse me, do I know you?" he asked, his voice cold and distant. Her blood ran cold. She was pretending that he was standing before her alive, but in fact he was pretending not to know her. Her teeth clenched as anger rose inside her after 7 years of pain and confusion. "You know who I am," she whispered, stepping closer. "Don't you dare pretend you don't. What does the woman beside you look like?" The woman beside Michael looked between them awkwardly. "Michael, who is this?" she asked. Michael sighed, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "You must be mistaken," he replied coldly. "I don't know you. Sorry, we have reservations tonight." He started to turn away, but Sarah wasn't about to let him off that easily. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back. The woman beside them was surprised. Michael's eyes suddenly darkened, his calm expression temporarily broken. "What are you doing?" she said, her voice cracking. "You don't know what you're talking about," Michael replied coldly. "If you don't leave us, I'll call security."
Sarah looked at him, her heart breaking all over again. She wanted to scream, cry, hit him until he confessed the truth, but his tone and posture told her that wasn't going to happen tonight. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she backed away. The woman beside Michael grabbed his arm, trying to shield him from the chaos Sarah had brought to their evening. But Sarah wasn't done yet.
"Fine," she said, her voice low but firm. "You can keep pretending if you want, but you know the truth, and you can't escape it." Michael's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, the tension thick between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The woman beside him disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sarah standing alone on the deck, her chest tight with anger and brokenness. The sound of the waves crashing against the bow echoed in her ears. Michael, the man she had known, the man she had loved and the father of her children, was now a stranger. A man who had pretended to be dead and left her to shoulder the burden. But Sarah was not about to let him off the hook. Not this time. not after everything he had put her through. The next few days on the cruise were a whirlwind. Sarah moved through her shifts like a ghost, her mind racing back to Michael. Every time she thought back to that moment on deck, a mixture of anger and heartache flooded her. How could he leave her, leave their children, fake his own death, and build a new life with a woman whose name she didn't know? She was angry at him for leaving her and the children, but also angry at herself for still feeling the longing deep inside. Every day she would see him on the train, laughing with a new friend, living in a world completely different from the life they had shared. Every time she saw him, the pain was deeper. She needed answers, and she couldn't wait any longer. Late at night, once her shift ended, Sarah decided she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to face him again, away from the curious eyes of her clients and the woman he was with. Sarah knew where he was. She had gone over the assignments when she first started, and now she stood in the dark hallway outside his door, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. She took a deep breath and knocked. There was a long silence. Sarah thought he wouldn't open the door, maybe he was sleeping or avoiding her. But then, the door creaked and Michael appeared in the doorway. He stood there, his face unreadable, the same cold expression he had worn when they first met. "What do you want, Sarah?" His voice was flat, almost dull. Sarah swallowed, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I want the truth. I deserve to know," she said, her voice steady even as her insides trembled. Michael sighed, quietly opening the door and motioning for her to come in. Sarah hesitantly stepped in, the pressure of what she was about to hear weighing her down. Stepping inside, she found his apartment luxurious, a far cry from the cramped space where she lived with the other employees. The living area was large with plush furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. The moonlight cast a silvery glow over the room. This was the life Michael had always dreamed of: luxury, ease, no heavy responsibilities. Michael gestured for her to sit, but Sarah stood there, arms crossed as if to protect herself from the coming storm of emotions. She knew what she had been waiting for had arrived. Michael walked to the window, staring out into the endless expanse of the ocean. For a long moment there was only the soft hum of the boat's engine and the waves lapping against the glass. Finally he said, his voice low and resigned, "I know what you're looking for. I didn't plan on it, you know." Sarah clenched her fists, her emotions rising. No plans? Leaving me, leaving the kids, pretending to be dead. Michael turned to face her, his expression softening a little. "I didn't plan on it being like this, but it's gotten so complicated." Sarah's voice escalated, frustration exploding in every word. "Michael, you disappeared. I thought you were dead. We had a funeral for you. I was raising the kids on my own, thinking you were gone forever. And all this time you were running away, living another life." He flinched at her words, his shoulders dropping a little. "I was in deep, Sarah. I owed more than you can imagine. Those debts weren't going to go away. I didn't know what to do, so when the opportunity came, when the accident happened, I took it." Sarah felt as if the ground was sinking beneath her. "You took the opportunity to disappear, to leave us." He nodded, his sad eyes failing to calm her anger. "Yes, I thought it was the only way. I thought if I faked my own death I could get out of debt, start over. And you didn't think about us." Sarah's voice shook. "You didn't think about how we would live, about the children." Michael replied, his voice breaking. "I thought about them every day, but I couldn't see any way out. Sarah, I was scared. I was in too deep and the pressure was getting to me, so I left." Sarah shook her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You left us to deal with the mess you created. Do you know what I've been through? What I've had to do to protect my children? To pay the debt you left behind?" He bowed his head to the floor, his voice low. "I know, and I'm sorry."
Sarah laughed bitterly, the pain surging from years of repression. Is an apology enough?
Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident on his face. "What else do you want me to say? Sarah, I was wrong, but I can't change the past." She stared at him, her mind racing. Sarah had spent years imagining this moment, what she would say when she saw Michael again. But now that he was actually here, all she felt was a suffocating sense of betrayal. "What about the others?" Sarah, she gestured toward the door, indicating the woman Michael was with. Michael hesitated, and that was all Sarah needed to understand. "I understand," she whispered, her heart sinking. "I didn't mean for it to be like this." "But what happened was hopeless," he said softly. Sarah stood there, staring at the man she had loved, the father of her children, and realized that the Michael she knew was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize, who had made the decisions that had shattered their lives. She took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "You may be able to get out of debt, Michael, but you won't get out of this. I won't let you get away with what you've done." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving Michael standing alone, his image blurred in the glass. Back in the cramped cabin, Sarah sat on the edge of the small bed, her mind still replaying the conversation. The truth had been revealed. Michael had abandoned her and the children, faked his own death, and was now living a life of luxury with a woman who probably had no idea of the mess he'd left behind. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, her hands shaking from the confrontation, but as the shock wore off, something new began to form: determination. She had spent years fighting to survive, working herself to the bone for her children, while bearing the brunt of Michael's betrayal. She had sacrificed everything, and now he stood there, walking away from his responsibilities as if nothing had happened. It wasn't fair, and she wasn't going to let him off the hook. Michael had always been good at hiding himself. He could charm anyone into believing he was trustworthy. But now she knew the truth, and with the truth came power. She had something he hadn't expected: knowledge. She knew what he had done, how he had abandoned them, and worse, that he had done it to avoid debts that were weighing her down and threatening the safety of her children.
It was time to fight. The next morning, she wasted no time. Her first step was to gather as much information as she could. She started with the ship's passenger records, easily accessible to staff who needed to know the passengers' identities. In them, the evidence of Michael's new identity was clear. He had changed his name, taken on a new persona, but to Sarah, he was still the one who had ruined everything.
Next, she took a quiet moment in the crew room to dig deeper into Michael's traveling companion, a woman named Claudia. She had booked the cruise as a luxury vacation, and she and Michael were listed as husband and wife. Thinking about the life they had built on lies made her sick. She knew she couldn't take on Michael again without a plan. Years of dealing with organized crime had taught her that survival required more than strength. She needed to be smart. If she went to the authorities, she would need evidence. If she went to the criminal organizations, she would have to make sure they weren't after her or her children. That night after her shift, she went to the ship's communications center. She had a contact who could help an old friend from the neighborhood who worked on the investigation. He wasn't exactly law-abiding, but that didn't matter to Sarah. She needed someone who could dig up information about Michael and fast. She sent a discreet message detailing what she had discovered about Michael. She asked for any information that linked him to old debts, or even evidence of illegal activities he had been involved in. Before long, she received a response that made her heart race. Michael had not only evaded his debts, he had also been involved in a massive scam, targeting a wealthy businessman in their hometown. The plan was simple: fake his own death, disappear, and let Sarah face the consequences. He had cleaned out their accounts before disappearing, leaving her with nothing but trouble. Her contact provided her with documents, wire transfers, fraudulent contracts, and even emails between Michael and his co-conspirators. The evidence was undeniable. If Sarah turned them over to the authorities, Michael would not only face creditors but prison time. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the files, the weight of what she held weighing heavily on her lap. This was how she would get her life back. With these documents, she could not only clear her name of debt, but also ensure that Michael was held accountable for all his actions. But there was still the problem of the criminal organizations. Sarah knew that if she didn't handle it carefully, they could come after her after Michael was eliminated. She needed a way to involve them without becoming their next target. The answer came to her in a moment of clarity. If she turned Michael over to the criminal gangs before going to the authorities, she could use his debt to negotiate safety for herself and her children. It was a risky plan, but it was the only reasonable option. The criminal gangs were connected, and if anyone could go after Michael and make him pay, it was them. With the evidence in hand, Sarah felt a new sense of purpose. She was no longer the weak woman she had been 7 years ago, broken-kneed and scared. She was stronger, tougher, and she wasn't going to let Michael destroy her life any further. She made the call. It was short and direct. Sarah explained her situation to the gangs, choosing her words carefully to make it clear that she wasn't their enemy. She wasn't running away, she was actually giving them something more valuable than money. Michael had gotten away with his scam for too long, and it was time for him to face the consequences. The man on the other end of the line, who had probably only worked with middlemen before, listened silently. His voice was as cold and sharp as Sarah had expected. But when she mentioned Michael and the evidence she had, there was a moment of hesitation. "You're saying you can give us someone who owes millions?" he asked, his voice growing sharper. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the feeling of fear in the back of her throat. Sarah had evidence of his current location, the crimes he had committed, and how he had lived under his new identity. "I have everything you need to find him," she said, her voice low but determined. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, as if the other person was considering her request. Sarah knew she was playing a dangerous game, but it was the only option. If she didn't handle things perfectly, she could face dire consequences, even more dangerous if they came after her children. Finally, the man spoke again. "So what do you want in return?" Sarah answered unwaveringly. "My safety," she continued. "I have paid off his debts for years. I want that debt cleared and my children, and I guaranteed peace forever." The man replied, "You will have Michael and all the money he owes you, but I will leave clean, no more threats, no more visits." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for a response, praying that this was the right move. She couldn't let things go wrong. "Okay," the man finally said, his voice colder than before, "but if you lied, if this was a ruse, you will regret it." Sarah quickly replied, "I didn't lie. I will send the documents tonight. You will see that it is all true."
The call ended. Sarah felt the weight of what she had just said begin to weigh heavily. She stared at the phone, her hands shaking. It was done. There was no turning back. That night, she gathered all the evidence from her contacts. She sent it all to law enforcement, along with Michael's new identity and current residence on the ship.
When the message was sent, Sarah collapsed onto her bed, her body exhausted from the long, stressful day. But her heart was filled with relief, knowing that she had taken action for the first time in years. The next morning, Sarah went about her normal duties on the ship, but the atmosphere on board seemed to grow more tense. She tried to keep her head down, to blend in with the other crew members, but every time she passed a group of guards or encountered a strange visitor, her heart beat faster. As the hours passed without action, Sarah began to wonder if the authorities had gotten her message, if they were planning something, or if she had miscalculated completely. Around noon, she noticed an unusual commotion near the main deck. Guards moved silently through the crowd, and she saw one of the senior officers heading toward the VIP room where Michael was. Sarah's heart rate increased. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She watched from a distance, careful not to be seen. She saw the guards come to Michael's room and knock on the door. Everything seemed to stand still for a moment before the doors opened and two guards entered. Though she couldn't see Michael's face, Sarah imagined the shock and panic he must have felt when they announced that his time was up. A moment later, Michael emerged with the guards, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger. But as they led him off the train, Sarah saw the look in his eyes as he recognized her. Michael didn't struggle, didn't try to run, simply followed them with his head held high, as if he was still in control. But Sarah knew the truth. He was finished. His lies, his betrayals had been punished. As Michael was led off the ship, Sarah stood in the darkness, gasping for breath as reality hit her once more. He was gone, and with him, the weight of the past 7 years was slowly being lifted. The debt, the fear, the constant struggle to survive was over. She had succeeded. She had regained control of her life. Yet even as the relief spread, Sarah knew that the story was not over. There were still pieces to clean up, wounds to heal, and there was still the matter of Claudia, who had played a role in the plot. But now she allowed herself a moment of triumph. The hardest part was over, and whatever came next, Sarah knew she had the strength to face it. After Michael was captured, Sarah decided that it was time to confront him one last time. She needed answers, needed to know how deep Claudia's involvement really ran. The cruise was not over yet, and Claudia was still on board, unaware of the approaching storm. Sarah waited until late at night, when most of the guests had retired to their rooms or gone to late-night entertainment, and the corridors of the ship were quiet. The soft hum of the engines was the only sound as Sarah approached Claudia's room. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from excitement. She had waited years for this moment, and now it had come. She knocked on the door, and after a few seconds the door opened. Claudia stood there in an elegant silk robe, her face twitching as she recognized Sarah. "Is there anything I can help you with, Claudia?" she asked in a smooth tone, as if nothing had happened. Sarah smiled nervously. "We need to talk." Claudia turned over her shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone else was there, then turned back with a sneer. "About what?" Michael. Sarah stepped closer, her voice low and firm. "About what he did, about your role in this." Claudia smiled coldly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb." Sarah couldn't contain her anger. "You've been with him for years, living off the money he stole, building a life on lies. You know exactly what I'm talking about." Sarah moved closer, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I don't know anything about his past," she said, her eyes fixed on Claudia. "You knew all along. You helped him disappear. You knew he left me and the kids with nothing, and you didn't care." Claudia's eyes glistened, perhaps with guilt, fear, or just plain frustration. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe, her voice hard. "I don't know the whole story. He said you left, that he had no choice but to leave. We were happy. Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. "Happy while I was struggling to feed my children, while I was threatened, harassed, forced to pay his debts." Claudia's face paled slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I didn't know how bad it was, didn't know or didn't care," Sarah replied, her eyes blazing with anger. "You were too busy living a lavish life to ask what happened to the life he left behind." Claudia faltered, her confidence wavering for the first time, shifting on her feet, looking around nervously as if searching for a way out of the conversation. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, but Michael chose his own path. I'm not responsible for that, and you're complicit." Sarah kept her tone steady, anger lurking just beneath the surface. "You helped him live a lie, and now he's paying for it. But don't think you're going to get away with it." Claudia's eyes widened in panic. "What do you mean?" "I've given everything to the authorities," Sarah continued, her voice cold and calculating. "Every piece of evidence of Michael's debt, his infidelity, and every lie he's told. They know about him and they know about you. It was only a matter of time before they came after you." Claudia held her breath, her hands gripping the edge of the door as panic flashed across her face. "You're not serious? I didn't do anything wrong. You let him ruin my life." Sarah added, her voice shaking with the weight of years of betrayal. "You stood by and watched him do it, so yes, I am serious. And believe me, you can't hide behind Michael anymore." In the silence, Claudia's eyes scanned the room, as if searching for an escape from this nightmare. She looked at Sarah, and for the first time there was no arrogance or contempt, only fear. "You're making a mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "No, my only mistake was trusting Michael. But it's over now. And that's the end of it." Without another word, Sarah turned and left, leaving Claudia standing alone in the doorway, her face pale and her body stiff. As Sarah returned to her cabin, the weight of everything she had been carrying slowly began to fade. Michael was gone, and soon Claudia was too. Her past and present for years were finally shifting, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt in control. The next morning, the steady hum of the ship's engines echoed below her cabin. The events of the night before felt like a dream, but reality returned quickly. Michael had been taken off the ship. Claudia was probably in a state of turmoil as she realized that her comfortable life was about to be shattered, and Sarah was finally free of the burden that had weighed her down for years. The tension that had been building slowly shifted, and Sarah took a deep breath without the fear gnawing at her insides. She had done it. She had taken control of her life, faced the man who had hurt her so deeply, and handed him over to face justice. This wasn't the ending she'd imagined, but it was the ending she needed. After a few minutes, Sarah walked to the small window of the cabin and looked out at the vast ocean before her. The sun shone on the waves. The horizon stretched out endlessly. The scene was beautiful and peaceful, but also a reminder that her journey was not over. She had fought hard to survive and now needed to find a way to live again. Sarah's mind drifted to Jacob and Lily, the reason she had persevered all these years. They were the light in her darkest hours, the motivation to get up each day and keep going when everything seemed insurmountable. Now she had the chance to give them the life they deserved, without fear, without debt, without the ghost of their father's betrayal. It was time to go home. When the boat docked in the bustling port city that afternoon, Sarah gathered her few belongings and headed for the stairs. The noise of the port was overwhelming, the shouts of dock workers, the rolling of trucks, the clanking of suitcases being unloaded. But for Sarah, all of these sounds faded away, leaving her focused on getting back to her children. She had arranged for Mrs. Reynolds to pick her up at the port and take her home. The thought of seeing her children again filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she was returning to them without the weight of fear and uncertainty. As Sarah stepped off the ship, she saw Mrs. Reynolds' familiar car parked near the curb. The old woman waved from the driver's seat, a smile spreading across her tried and true face as Sarah approached. Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude. Mrs. Reynolds had been her rock in her darkest moments, helping her care for the twins when things seemed impossible. "Welcome back," Miss Sarah said warmly as she slid into the passenger seat. "How was the trip?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking out the window as the bustling city became too much to handle. Finally, she smiled softly. "But it's over." Mrs. Reynolds patted Sarah's hand. "We've waited a long time, honey." Sarah felt lighter than ever as they drove home together, toward a new beginning filled with hope and happiness with their loved ones. She felt joy knowing that her children would be so happy to see her again. They had talked about her constantly since she left. A heavy feeling tightened in Sarah's throat as she thought of them. "I missed you so much," she whispered, feeling emotional. The rest of their drive passed in comfortable silence, and soon they arrived at the small apartment building Sarah called home. As she stepped out of the car, Sarah's heart raced with excitement. Jacob and Lily were surely waiting inside, their faces beaming at the sight of their mother. She couldn't wait to hug them and tell them everything would be okay. For the first time in 7 long years, Sarah truly believed it. Sarah walked toward the apartment building, taking in the familiar brick facade, a familiar sight that brought a warm feeling. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs, thinking of Jacob and Lily's difficult years, the sleepless nights and constant worry that had led to this moment. Finally, she was truly home, with the knowledge that the past no longer held her back. As she reached the apartment door, Sarah heard a boisterous laugh coming from inside. She smiled, her hand reaching out to the window as she savored the thrill, then took a deep breath and opened the door. The sight before her made her heart swell. Jacob and Lily were sitting on the floor with Mrs. Reynolds, surrounded by toys and coloring books. The children looked up in unison, their eyes shining with excitement. Immediately, Jacob shouted, "Mommy's home," and rushed towards her, followed by Lily, equally delighted. Lily's face was alight with joy.
Sarah knelt down, arms wide, as her children ran to hug her, almost knocking her over. She hugged them, feeling the warmth and relief. "I missed you so much," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion, as she kissed the tops of their heads. "I missed you too, Mum."
Mrs. Reynolds stood up slowly, stretching her stiff back before smiling warmly at Sarah. "We've been checking in on you every day. The kids will be so happy to know you're back for good." Sarah nodded, still hugging her children. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. I don't know what I would do without you." The old woman waved her hand dismissively, her eyes full of affection. "Nothing. I'm just glad you're okay. That's the most important thing." Sarah smiled, but there was still a heaviness in her eyes that Mrs. Reynolds could see. She moved closer and patted Sarah on the shoulder. "I'll let you enjoy this moment. Mom deserves some time with you." With a final word of encouragement, Mrs. Reynolds gathered her things and left, pausing only once to nod encouragingly. "You're strong, Sarah. Remember that." The door closed behind Mrs. Reynolds, and Sarah sat on the floor with Jacob and Lily, enjoying the laughter and warmth. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. The heavy pressure on her chest was gone. They spent the afternoon playing with toys, coloring and sharing stories. Sarah watched her children in amazement, realizing how many precious moments she had missed in the years she had struggled to survive. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the evening sky turned pink and orange, Sarah tucked Jacob and Lily into bed. The children were tired, squinting as she read them a bedtime story. Lily curled up under the covers, hugging her stuffed bunny, while Jacob lay beside her, squinting at the sound of her mother's soft voice. "You're really staying this time, aren't you?" Jacob asked softly, his voice cutting through the silence. Sarah's heart sank at the question. She leaned down and kissed her son's forehead. "Yes, honey, I'll stay forever. You don't have to leave." Jacob was silent, eyes half closed with sleep, and Lily had fallen into a deep sleep, a soft snore filling the room. Sarah sat there for a moment, looking at her 2 children, her heart filled with love and a deep sense of peace. They were safe. Finally, they were safe. She quietly left the room and closed the door, walking into the living room and sitting down on the old armchair. The apartment was small and simple, but it was home, it was theirs. For the first time in years, Sarah didn't feel like a prisoner in her own life. She was free to start over, free to build a new future for herself and her children. But the burden of the past still echoed in her mind. Michael was gone, but the memories of his betrayal, the years of struggle, were not easy to forget. She had survived, but now she had to find a way to live again, to rebuild her life without the constant fear. Sarah knew it wouldn't be easy. Deep scars and many difficult days still awaited. But as she sat there, in the quiet of her apartment, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She didn't have all the answers, but at least for now it was enough. Over the next few days, Sarah adjusted to her new life. It was still challenging: bills to pay, food to buy, and raising two energetic children on her own. But things were easier now. There was no shadow of Michael's betrayal, no more calls from debt collectors, no more fear that everything would fall apart at any moment. For the first time, she could make decisions about her future and her children without the pressure of the past. One evening, as Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, she recalled everything that had led her to this moment. Michael's arrest had been reported in the media, his crimes public. Michael could face years in prison, even life in prison, depending on the extent of his financial crimes. Sarah wasn't sure where she'd gotten herself, but it didn't matter now. She'd done her part, and as she sipped her tea, a gentle sense of closure washed over her. The man who had caused her so much pain was no longer a part of her life. It was time to let go and truly start over. The next day, sunlight filtered through the curtains, and the noise of the city began to creep into the apartment. Sarah could hear Jacob and Lily laughing in their room, bringing a smile to her face. These simple, beautiful moments were what mattered most. She'd spent years just surviving, forgetting how to live. But now she had the chance to build something better for herself and her children, and she wasn't about to waste it. After years of waiting, Sarah finally felt excited about the future. That night, after tucking Jacob and Lily into bed, she stood by the window of her small apartment, watching the bright lights of the city. The sound of traffic mixed with the hustle and bustle of life created a special atmosphere of peace. Dark memories gradually faded away, replaced by new hope. When she turned back to the window to get ready for bed, a soft smile appeared on her lips. Sarah knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was now free to decide to move forward. That night she fell into a deep sleep without worries, enjoying the peace she deserved.